I noticed the story will be quite long, approximately 5,000 words. Let me write it directly here. I noticed the moment he said estate before he said grandmother. That was the tell. Not the handshake, not the smile, not the way he straightened his tie when my granddaughter walked into the room. It was that single word, spoken in the wrong order, and I filed it away the way I used to file report cards, quietly, without comment, but nothing forgotten. My name is Margaret, and I've lived 68 years on this earth without once being called naive. I taught high school English for 31 years in Charlottesville, Virginia. I have read every kind of human being there is, the ones who lie boldly, the ones who lie softly, and the ones who smile while they do both. I thought I was done with all of that when I retired. I thought the hardest thing left in my life would be learning to sleep past 5 in the morning. Then my husband passed, and everything I thought I knew about what came next turned out to be wrong. My husband, I will call him my love, because that is what he was, died on a Tuesday in October 14 months ago. Pancreatic cancer. 12 weeks from diagnosis to the end. We had 41 years together. A farmhouse on 11 acres outside Charlottesville. A retirement account I had never once looked at because he managed everything. And one granddaughter named Claire, who drove 6 hours from Nashville the day we got the diagnosis and did not leave until after the funeral. Claire is 24. She has her grandfather's eyes and my stubbornness, which is either a blessing or a problem depending on the day. She works in graphic design, rents a small apartment, and calls me every Sunday without fail. When her grandfather died, she sat beside me on the porch swing every evening for 2 weeks and didn't say much. She just sat there. That is the kind of person she is. I want you to understand who she is before I tell you what happened, because everything that came next happened because of her, and she deserves for you to know her first. 6 weeks after the funeral, a man named Derek arrived. He was the son of my husband's college roommate, or so he said. I had heard the name once or twice over the years, in passing, the way you hear names at the edges of someone else's life. His father had passed years earlier, and Derek had apparently found my husband's obituary online and felt moved to reach out. That was the word he used when he called. Moved. He came to the house on a Saturday. He was 41 years old, well-dressed without being flashy, with the kind of easy manners that suggest either good upbringing or careful practice. He brought a casserole dish wrapped in a dish towel, which is a very deliberate choice of gift. Not flowers, which would be showy. Not nothing, which would be cold. A casserole, which says, I am practical. I am thoughtful. I am the kind of person who feeds people. I thanked him. I offered him coffee. We sat at the kitchen table, and he talked about his father and my husband, and the stories were specific enough to be plausible. He said he lived in Richmond now, about an hour's drive, and that he hoped he might check in on me from time to time. He said he knew what it was like to lose a parent, and he didn't want me rattling around in this big house alone. I thanked him again. I walked him to the door. I stood on the porch and watched him drive away, and then I went inside and wrote his full name on a notepad and set it beside my phone. I did not throw it away. He came back 2 weeks later, and 2 weeks after that, each time with something small. A bag of apples from an orchard near Richmond, a paperback he thought I might like, a jar of local honey. Each time staying about an hour, sitting at that same kitchen table, talking easily about nothing in particular. It was on his 4th visit that he asked about the property. We were sitting on the back porch, looking out at the pasture. The October light was doing that thing it does in Virginia, going gold and low across the grass. And I will admit it was a beautiful afternoon. He asked, the way you might ask about the weather, how many acres we had out here. I told him 11. He nodded slowly, like he was absorbing something meaningful. Then he asked if I had ever thought about what I would do with it, long term. I said I hadn't given it much thought yet. He nodded again and changed the subject. I went back inside and added a note beside his name on the notepad. By his 6th visit, he had asked about the land 3 more times. Never directly. Always sideways, wrapped in something that sounded like concern. Did I find the upkeep overwhelming? Had I thought about whether the house was too large for one person? Did I know what property values in this county were doing? I answered each question briefly and moved on. But I heard every single one. What I did not tell him was that my husband had left behind considerably more than 11 acres and a farmhouse. The retirement account I had never looked at turned out to hold just over $2 million. There was also a life insurance policy, a modest investment portfolio, and the property itself, which a neighbor had once told me was worth more than I probably realized given what had happened to land prices in Albemarle County. I had sat with our family attorney 3 weeks after the funeral and learned, for the first time in 41 years, exactly what we had built together. I had told no one except Claire, and I had specifically, deliberately, told no one else. Derek did not know any of this. Or at least, he shouldn't have. But on his 7th visit, something happened that changed the temperature of everything. He mentioned, casually, that he had run into my husband's attorney in Richmond. Just in passing, he said, at a charity event. Small world. He mentioned the attorney's name, the correct name, and said the man seemed well. I kept my face still. I said that was a coincidence, but the attorney my husband used was not a Richmond attorney. His office was in Charlottesville. He had no reason to be at a charity event in Richmond. And his name was not the kind of name you guess. I excused myself to refill our coffee cups. I stood at the kitchen counter with my back to the door and breathed very carefully for about 30 seconds. Then I refilled the cups and went back outside and talked pleasantly about the weather for another 20 minutes until Derek left. That night, I called Claire. I told her everything, the questions about the property, the slow accumulation of visits. The attorney's name dropped like it was nothing. I read her the notes I had been keeping, date by date, question by question. Claire was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Grandma, I think I know how he found out about the estate." She had met Derek twice, briefly, on visits when he had happened to come by while she was there. She had been polite to him the way you are polite to someone your grandmother seems comfortable with. On the 2nd visit, she had mentioned, without thinking, that she had been helping me organize some of her grandfather's paperwork. She had said it was a lot to get through. She had not said anything specific, but she had said enough. She said she was sorry. I told her she had nothing to be sorry for. She said she was coming up that weekend. I told her she didn't need to. She came anyway. We sat at the kitchen table that Saturday with my notepad and a legal pad she had brought from Nashville, and we mapped out everything we knew. Derek had shown up 6 weeks after my husband died, claiming a family connection that was plausible but unverifiable. He had systematically asked about the property on almost every visit. He had somehow obtained or guessed the name of the estate attorney. He had been carefully positioning himself as a trusted presence in my life. The casseroles, the apples, the jar of honey. Claire asked me what I thought he was working toward. I said I thought he was working toward being present at the moment decisions got made, that he wanted to be in the room, trusted, helpful when it came time to settle the estate formally, that a man who couldn't inherit anything directly might still find ways to benefit if he became sufficiently embedded in the process. As an advisor, as a helper, as someone I relied on. Claire said, "What do we do?" I said, "We find out who he actually is first." I hired a private investigator. I want to be clear about that decision because some people might hesitate. I did not hesitate. I called a firm in Charlottesville that a colleague from the school district had used years ago in a different situation entirely, and I explained that I needed a background check on a man who had inserted himself into my life, and that I needed it done quietly and thoroughly. What came back 2 weeks later was not what I expected. Derek was who he said he was in the most literal sense. His father had indeed been my husband's college roommate. He had grown up in Northern Virginia, gone to a state school, worked for 15 years in real estate development, and then spent 3 years doing almost nothing professionally that could be clearly documented. The investigator flagged that gap. 3 years of minimal income, no business registration, no verifiable employer. And during that same period, 2 separate complaints filed against him with the Virginia Department of Professional and Occupational Regulation, both related to financial impropriety in real estate transactions. Neither complaint had resulted in formal charges. Both had been settled quietly. There was also this. Derek had a half-sister. Her name was on a property deed in Henrico County. The property had been purchased 18 months ago. The purchase price, according to public records, was significantly beyond what his documented income would support. The investigator could not tell me where that money had come from. I sat with that report for one evening. I read it twice. Then I called our family attorney, and I told him everything, starting from the first visit and ending with the investigator's report, and I asked him what he thought I should do. He said, "Margaret, I think you should let him keep coming over." I understood what he meant. 3 weeks later, Derek called and asked if he might stop by on a Saturday, because he had something he wanted to discuss with me. He said he hoped I wouldn't take it the wrong way, but he had been thinking about my situation and he had some ideas he wanted to share. He said he had connections in estate planning and property management, and he thought there were some things I might not be aware of that could really benefit me. I said Saturday was fine. I called Claire that night. I told her what Derek had said. She asked if she could be there. I said yes, but I told her to come early before he arrived and to stay in the kitchen when he and I sat in the living room. I told her I needed her close but not visible. She said, "Grandma, are you sure about this?" I said, "I've been sure about very little this year, but I'm sure about this." She arrived Friday evening, and we sat on the porch swing and talked until late, the way we used to when she was a teenager staying the summer. She told me about a project she was working on in Nashville, a logo series for a small restaurant group, and I told her about the novel I had been trying to read and failing to concentrate on. We didn't talk about Derek. We had said everything there was to say. The next morning, she helped me make coffee, and then she sat at the kitchen table with a book, and I went to wait in the living room. Derek arrived at 10 o'clock. He was carrying a folder. That was the first thing I noticed. He had come prepared. He set the folder on the coffee table, still closed, and sat across from me and spent 5 minutes on pleasantries before he opened it. Inside were documents. He had printed what appeared to be a property valuation, my property, with an estimated current market value that was notably lower than what the county assessor had told me. He had also printed something that he described as an estate restructuring proposal, which I will not pretend to fully understand in real time, but which suggested, in broad terms, transferring certain assets into a management structure in which he would serve in an advisory capacity. The language was careful and technical and clearly written by someone other than Derek. He explained it the way a man explains something to a woman he believes will not look too closely. He spoke slowly. He used phrases like, "simplify things for you," and "take the burden off your plate," and "your husband would have wanted you to be taken care of." That last phrase, I let him finish. I thanked him for his thoughtfulness. I said it was a great deal to consider, and asked if he would mind leaving the folder with me so I could review it more carefully. He said, of course, absolutely, take all the time I needed. I walked him to the door. We said goodbye. I watched his car reach the end of the driveway. Then I went to the kitchen. Claire was standing at the counter. She had heard everything from where she sat, which is exactly what I had intended. She was holding her phone. She had been recording the audio since the moment he sat down. We had discussed this the night before. Virginia is a one-party consent state. I had looked it up. She set the phone on the table and looked at me. I sat down across from her. I said, "He had my property's parcel number on that valuation document." She said, "I know. I saw it when he opened the folder. The parcel number is not public information in the way a general address is. It can be found, but it requires deliberate searching. It means he had looked up this specific property specifically. He had not come with general ideas. He had come with a plan built around this house, this land, this specific estate." I called the attorney that afternoon. I sent him photographs of every page of the folder, which Claire had taken while Derek was still talking and I was nodding attentively. I sent him the audio recording. I told him I was ready to proceed with whatever came next. What came next took 6 weeks. I will not walk you through all of it, because some of it was tedious and some of it I don't fully understand even now. What I can tell you is that the documents Derek had brought were not legal in any meaningful sense. They were designed to look official without binding anyone except eventually me. The attorney described them as a framework for exploitation and said he had seen variations of this before, usually targeting widows and widowers in the first 2 years after a spouse's death, when estate paperwork is still being finalized and the surviving partner is often overwhelmed and trusting. He said Derek had likely done this before. He said the complaints filed with the regulatory board were consistent with this pattern. He said we had enough between the recording, the documents, and the investigator's report to refer the matter to the Commonwealth's attorney's office. I said, "Let's do that." Derek called twice during those 6 weeks. I answered both times and was pleasant and said I was still reviewing things and hoped to have some thoughts soon. I made myself sound like exactly what he expected me to be. A tired, slightly overwhelmed woman who needed someone to guide her. It required effort, but 31 years of teaching teenagers to read Shakespeare prepares you for a great many performances. The referral to the Commonwealth's attorney took its own time. I will not pretend the outcome was swift or cinematic. There was no moment where he was led away in handcuffs while I stood on the porch with my arms folded. What happened was quieter than that, and in some ways more satisfying. He was contacted by investigators. He was interviewed. The 2 prior regulatory complaints were reopened in light of new information. His half-sister's property purchase was looked at more carefully. I was told, without specifics, that the matter was being pursued and that I might be asked to provide a formal statement, which I gave willingly and in considerable detail. I have not heard from Derek since the week the investigators contacted him. I assume he understood at some point that the woman he had been bringing casseroles and apple bags and jars of honey had been watching him the entire time. I hope that understanding was uncomfortable. I don't apologize for hoping that. Claire was there the evening I gave my formal statement, sitting in the attorney's waiting room with 2 cups of coffee and a book she wasn't reading. When I came out, she handed me a cup and didn't say anything right away, which is exactly right. We drove home and sat on the porch swing until the light went completely. The November air was cold enough that we had blankets, which is something we have done since she was small. Blankets on the porch swing, no matter the season, because her grandfather always said the cold made the stars look sharper. She said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I think I'm the most okay I've been since October." She leaned her head on my shoulder and I thought about her grandfather, the way I think about him most evenings. I thought about the 41 years, and the 11 acres, and the retirement account I never looked at, and how I did not know the full shape of what we had built until after he was gone, and how strange it is that grief and gratitude can occupy the same moment without contradiction. I want to say something to you directly, before we're finished here. If you are a widow, or a widower, or you know someone who is, please hear this. The first 2 years are when you are most vulnerable to exactly this kind of approach. Not because you are foolish, because you are tired and your attention is on grief, and the people who do this are practiced at appearing helpful. They bring casseroles. They ask careful questions. They say your name kindly and wait. The things that protected me were simple. I kept notes. I said very little about finances to anyone new. I trusted the people who had always been trustworthy. And I paid attention to the order in which a man chose his words, because the order almost always tells you what he's actually thinking about. Estate before grandmother, I noticed. And I chose to notice quietly, for as long as it took. My granddaughter, who drove from Nashville and stayed, and sat at the kitchen table with a book and her phone, and heard everything. She is the bravest person I know, not because she did something dramatic, because she stayed. Because she sat with me on a porch swing under a blanket in November and leaned her head on my shoulder and asked if I was okay. That is what it looks like. The thing that outlasts all of it, not the fraud, not the documents, not the careful plans some man built in a folder and carried up my porch steps on a Saturday morning. Just her. Just the blanket and the cold air and the stars, sharp the way her grandfather always said they were. That's what he never accounted for. He came for the estate. He forgot about the family.